she was talking to the young people that were helping. But I just want to give you an idea of the sort of situation that they're living in now. People that haven't left their home, they don't have anywhere else to go. This is their fridge, and she was just telling me there's nothing in the fridge here. So even people that had food in the fridge came in district. So it's a place where there's a lot of bars and restaurants. And I'll just give you a look down. This is behind her house. And I don't know if you can see here, this was the roof of a restaurant, a bar, a pub really, that I actually have been to many times. And if you look farther down, you can just see.
Now, Rebecca, apologies. You're breaking up quite a bit there. Sorry to interrupt you. Maybe if you could just stand still. Unfortunately, the signal is a little weak right now. So sorry, if you wouldn't mind continuing on.
Oh. I mean, she was just telling me that she was in the living room here when the blast went off. Her father, who's 95, actually got a piece of shrapnel in his eye. He's here. He had to go for a surgery. But if you just look, I don't know if I can just show you down here, the sheer destruction of the whole neighborhood here. So as we've been saying all day, the rescue efforts are ongoing. Also, the cleanup efforts are ongoing. This is a city that is still very much in disaster mode.
Yeah, Rebecca, like you say, disaster mode. There's a state of emergency in effect, and there's a lot of growing anger over what happened. What are you hearing?
Well, everybody I talked to, also the woman that owns this home, she basically said right away that she's angry with the government. People are definitely holding the government responsible. We've heard very little confirmed information about what happened. So we know that there was a large deposit, almost 3,000 tons of this chemical sitting in Beirut's port. But what we don't have answers to is why. And the other thing I would say is that people are angry because they don't feel like there will be a proper investigation. A lot of people are calling for an international investigation into the incident. They say that their leaders are corrupt, that they can't trust them, and they don't believe that anybody will be properly held accountable if this investigation is Lebanese. And the last thing I would say, Hannah, is that, you know, people have been on the streets here against government mismanagement and corruption and nepotism, you know, for months since October. And this is likely just to reignite those protests.
Rebecca, really appreciate your reporting. That's Rebecca Collard in Beirut. Well, Canada is stepping up to offer support to Beirut. The Minister of International Development, Karina Gould, says Canada is looking both at immediate needs and long-term needs.
We know that there is the emergency and the urgent response that's needed right now in Lebanon, but we also know that this is going to be a long-term reconstruction effort. And I want to assure Canadians, Lebanese Canadians, as well as the people of Lebanon, that Canada will continue to be there for the long term. As I mentioned, we've had a long-term, fruitful relationship with Lebanon and the Lebanese people over many decades. And even before this terrible tragedy, Canada has been a strong partner for Lebanon. Lebanon is an integral part of Canada's Middle East strategy, and we know that there is a very strong Lebanese community here in Canada that is committed to seeing the long-term reconstruction and, of course, benefit for the Lebanese people. We are increasingly worried about the financial situation in the country and recognize that the destruction of the port has exacerbated some of the challenges that Lebanon is already facing.
Our chief political correspondent, Rosemary Barton, has more on the $5 million Canada is pledging and what happens next.
Well, some of it has already made its way there through the Canadian Red Cross to the Lebanese Red Cross. That $1.5 million the minister made clear this morning is really for the next 48 hours, which are going to be pretty vital to making sure they can keep some people alive, frankly. The rest of the money will be for shoring up shelters, making sure there's enough food and water, some of the things that were already under pressure because of the economic situation in Lebanon. But the government also made clear this morning that this money cannot go to the Lebanese government. It will go to humanitarian organizations because of the concerns that Rebecca was talking about there around corruption and mismanagement inside government. So Canada is very much waiting for other countries, perhaps France, for instance, to take the lead in an international response, or for the United Nations, who is also on the ground, to better determine what will be needed in the days and weeks ahead. The minister was also asked about some of that strain that Lebanon was under even before this happened, and the fact that there are ongoing concerns about how best to get assistance into the country, given some of the concerns around the way government works or doesn't work in this case. Here's the minister.
We recognize that that has to come with significant fiscal and political reforms to ensure that, that assistance goes to, benefiting the lives of the Lebanese people. And that is something that we have been very firm in. And so that's one of the reasons why we continue to provide our assistance through trusted humanitarian partners who are operating on the ground, but recognizing that, this disaster in particular has exacerbated what was already a very precarious financial position.
So it does sound as though more aid is certainly on the table, or human resources if needed as well. But the Canadian government also wants to make sure that it is going into the right hands, and wants some clear indications from political leaders in that country that if anything happens going forward, there will also be significant political reform.
Yeah. 11,000 Canadians have registered with the government, with Foreign Affairs. What's the government doing to help Canadians there?
Well, for now, the answer is not a whole lot. The embassy had been shut down. It's planning to reopen on Monday, and consular services will be available for any of those Canadians on the ground. It's unclear right now whether they will, in fact, be able to return to Canada. If they are Canadian citizens, certainly. If they are permanent residents, they would be allowed back in. But beyond that, because of the pandemic, there are extreme limitations on who can come into this country. And so for the large diaspora of Lebanese Canadians here, those who identify as Lebanese, about 250,000. That might make it complicated if they have concerns for family members who have been hit hard by this, injured or otherwise. Trying to get them into Canada to help them will be more complicated. But certainly, at least the embassy will be reopened on Monday, and Canadians who are living in Lebanon will be able to get some help there.
That's CBC Chief Political Correspondent Rosemary Barton in Ottawa. Now to news here at home. Toronto's interim police chief has just apologized for the way the force handled the case of Devonte Miller. Miller is the young black man who was assaulted by an off-duty police officer in 2016. Earlier, the interim chief said a new report he just received shed light on what the police did wrong the night of the assault.
The report focused on the issue of a police service's duty to report to the Special Investigations Unit. It found that on the night in question, we were notified of the actions of Constable Theriault while he was on leave, also known as off-duty. As we have so many times before, we used the information available to us that evening to determine whether we should report to the SIU. We made the wrong decision that night. As a result of that decision, trust has been broken between the police, Devonte Miller, and the broader community. For that, on behalf of the Toronto Police Service, I want to apologize.
The CBC's Megan Fitzpatrick has more on today's apology and the priorities of Toronto's new interim police chief.
Yeah, the report he's referring to, Hannah, we believe is issued by the Office of the Independent Police Review Directorate. That's a civilian oversight body that investigates complaints from the public. And we do know that a complaint was filed by Devonte Miller's lawyer, Julian Falconer, both against the Toronto Police Service and the Durham Regional Police. The incident happened in Whitby, Ontario, in the jurisdiction of the Durham Police, but involved Michael Theriault, a Toronto police officer. And neither police service notified the SIU, which is the police oversight body that investigates incidents involving police officers that result in serious injury or death. The SIU was only notified about what happened that night by Devonte Miller's lawyer 4 months after the incident, and it was that notification by the lawyer that led to the charges that were laid against Michael Theriault and his brother, Christian Theriault, who is not a police officer. and Michael Theriault was found guilty in June of assault. Now here in the apology, we heard Raymer say that he has received this report, and based on it, he issued the apology and said that the wrong decision was made the night of the incident, that the Toronto Police Service was informed about what had happened and didn't notify SIU. When he was asked to explain why not, he didn't have some answers there, not at this time anyway. Hannah saying he can't comment on that yet. So there's still a few unanswered questions. This complaint by Julian Falconer accuses the Toronto Police Service of a cover-up, and that's in part because the father of Michael and Christian Theriault is also a Toronto police officer and worked in the professional standards unit. He is accused of trying to interfere with the case on his son's behalf, essentially, and the police chief was asked there for more information about where those allegations stand, and again he said he couldn't comment on that. As for why it's taken so long for this apology to be issued to DeFonte Miller, whose injuries were so severe he lost sight in one eye, he said he's only been on the job for 5 days, that he feels like it was important for him as chief to do that, interim chief. He just took over. Chief Mark Saunders retired last week. Chief Mark Saunders is named in the complaint, Hannah. And just lastly on this, he was asked if Michael Theriault is still employed by the Toronto Police Service. He is, and that's because the court case isn't totally over. Both sides are appealing the verdict that was issued in June.
And before we get on to the other priorities of Toronto's interim police chief, you mentioned the former chief of police, Mark Saunders, was mentioned in this as well. Was he aware of what happened, and was he a part of not turning it over to the SIU?
So that question was asked in the news conference, and the answer was that Chief Saunders was not informed that night. Interim Chief Raymer saying he believes Saunders and he himself, Raymer, only learned of it later. And we have heard from Saunders in the wake of this case. He has denied any kind of cover-up and has stood by his Toronto Police Service.
Okay, so on to other priorities for the new interim chief of police. What did he have to say about his priorities over the next few months?
Yeah, he outlined a couple of things he wants to focus on. One of them is looking at how the police service responds to mental health calls. Another is, again, working on a strategy to identify and eliminate anti-Black racism, he said. Also a focus on guns and gangs in this city, talking about wanting to focus more on gang prevention strategies, Hannah. Also talking about taking a more aggressive approach to traffic enforcement, but significantly too, he talked about the priority of body-worn cameras for Toronto police officers. This has been a project that's been underway for some time, has been more at the forefront lately in the last few months, and he is saying he's anxious for this project to be approved by the Toronto Police Board at their next meeting, and he hopes that these cameras will be worn by frontline officers by the end of the year. More broadly, he was talking about trying to restore trust in the Toronto Police Service, which is an acknowledgement that it's broken with a lot of members of the community. So he was talking about needing to restore trust and as well the issue of accountability, and that is what led him to issue that apology right after saying that, Hannah, saying that doing that is an example of trying to hold the Toronto Police Service accountable, acknowledging what they've done wrong. He said it was a mistake not to call the SIU that night, and that they will change their policies on how and when they notify the SIU.
That's the CBC's Megan Fitzpatrick in Toronto. 75 years ago today, the United States dropped a nuclear bomb on Hiroshima. Still ahead, we'll tell you how the people of Japan are marking the event. This is CBC News Network. Of making and storing ketamine. Xu Weihong is the third Canadian to be given the death penalty for drug crimes. A Chinese accomplice was sentenced to life in prison, and the two were tried for the same crime. Today's verdict comes as Canada's relationship with China worsens. Tensions are high over the arrest and detention of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou and the detention of two Canadians, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig. Freelance reporter Patrick Falk has more from Beijing.
Well, details are incredibly scant for the time being, but what we do know is that the Canadian national by the name of Xu Weihong was sentenced to death following a trial in Guangzhou in southern China. And we know from a notice that was posted on the website of the Guangzhou Intermediate Court that he had purchased equipment and raw materials to manufacture drugs in 2016, and that public security officers had seized 120 grams of ketamine from his home and other residences. The other pertinent bit of information was that there was another man, a Chinese national by the name of Wen Guanxiong, who was also